Boa tarde. Mais uma vez, nós estamos aqui reunidos para ouvir a nossa queridíssima Patricia Hill Collins. E depois da aula pública, a gente tem aqui a participação, vamos ter a participação da mãe Marta de Ogum, Marta Celestino. Marta, que tem mais de 25 anos de experiência em multinacionais das áreas financeira e marketing. Ela trouxe seus talentos para a Ebony English em 2014. O objetivo dela era de reestruturar a escola, que é pioneira no ensino de inglês com cultura negra. Marta trabalhou para tornar a escola referência por sua qualidade, metodologia e uma das únicas instituições deste padrão, liderada por afrodescendentes nas Américas. Além disso, Marta Celestino é pesquisadora, consultora em inovação e diversidade. Ela palestrou no TEDx São Paulo e é apaixonada por construir pontes com a diáspora africana. Sua missão é dar suporte necessário para atingirem seus objetivos e experienciar novos lugares e culturas. Sua inspiração vem da liberdade, mobilidade, espiritualidade e do continente africano, o berço da humanidade. Sem mais delongas, eu deixo vocês com a nossa queridíssima Patricia Hill Collins.
Hello. I am worried about losing my voice. So I'm going to talk to you today as if I were talking to you one at a time. I want you to imagine you and me chatting. This is not a late night radio program where the person is talking to you in a strange way, but my voice is giving me problems today. I sound worse than I feel, and I just want to make sure that I don't lose my voice. So today I'm going to sit down as long as I can because I like to stand up and I like to walk around when I talk, but I want to make sure I keep my energy up for you. Today's talk, Sharpening Intersectionality's Critical Edge, comes from my concern with what happens to resistant knowledge, what happens to political projects that may start off as radical, as critical, as cutting edge, when they confront power relations that do not want them to remain so. Today, I'll be talking about two of my projects, Black Feminist Thought, a little bit more than I did 2 weeks ago, and Intersectionality, which is the project that I'm finalizing now, because both of these projects are critical, albeit in different ways. I think it's important that we have to get out in front of our work being changed and used for purposes for which we had no original intent. Each of you, think about your intellectual work, the questions that really concern you, the things that you care about, why you're willing to go through the pain and suffering of commuting to this campus through that traffic. We've all been there. And ask yourself, why is this important? I would say to each of you that whatever your vision or your idea is, if it is in defense of social justice, it is worth doing. But it is so easy to lose your way and forget what started you on a path, particularly when it comes to ideas and scholarship. So, intersectionality is a powerful set of ideas that had the luxury of flying under the radar for quite some time. Not anymore. It is popular. And when something gets popular, you have to ask yourself why. It's kind of like the difference between early hip-hop and commercial hip-hop. When something gets popular and is marketable and benefits some people over others, we have to really look at the work that we have created and ask ourselves, how do we sharpen our critical edge now? Next slide. This is the third of 4 public lectures at this wonderful university. And I realize I haven't thanked people yet, so I'm thanking Melvina. I'm thanking the members of the social science unit. This has been a wonderful visit. I don't know whether I've been the best visitor because I have not been feeling well, but this is a wonderful place where you are going to school. So I take what I do here quite seriously. This is the third of 4 lectures where today I will be referring back to aspects of the first 2 lectures, but not going through them. And this lecture prepares you for the 4th and final lecture next week, which will be about how all this comes together around the idea of violence. You can have come to 1, and that's enough, or 2, or all 3, or all 4. But if you attend all 4, you should see a progression. What does it mean to be critical? 2 meanings. Most people, when they think of being critical, they think of critical as critique or protest. We're being critical when we stand up and say, down with racism. That is, in fact, being critical and being very visible. Being critical is criticizing both the social practices and ideas that uphold social injustice. But criticism is always a response to something else. Criticism is a response to racism that's setting the terms of the debate, or to heterosexism that's setting the terms of the debate. It is easy to assume that it is enough to simply criticize and leave it to someone else to do the work of fixing the problem. This happens quite a bit among academics. I don't know whether it happens here or not, but I've spent enough time among American academics who are very skilled at criticizing what other people are doing, but who have very few solutions to the problems that they are diagnosing. But critical as critique and protest is foundational to politics. I don't want to minimize it, but I want to say it's not enough to just be critical and criticize. The second aspect is critical as important or essential. Something is critical for life. It is critical to have water or you die. It is critical to have food or you die. It is critical to have beauty in your life, surprise, surprise, or you may die. You need art. It is critical to have ideas in your life that explain the world and help you take action in that world and own that world. That is critical for. Critical as important or essential. Critical as life-sustaining. For whom? For what purposes? This is difficult, but I'm figuring it out. I'm afraid if I do this too much, they'll keep changing the slide. So you have to help me. The example of Black feminism is a really good case of these two aspects of critical of and critical for. Why Black feminism exists is not to produce wonderful books and films and movies about Black women that have no relationship to power and social injustice. But Black feminism exists in response to the treatment of Black women. It is critical of the treatment of Black women. It criticizes the treatment of Black girls. Let me come back to that. And it is critical for Black women. I put up here two graphics I believed I used earlier, but if not, let me just say a word about them here. The graphic on the top, both of these graphics are about the treatment of Black girls at the hands of police or school personnel. So often, violence against Black people looks so much to the experiences of young Black men or adult men. It doesn't look to women. But these graphics show you that Black girls experience a gender-specific example of racial violence, or a racialized example of gender violence, although I can't make that case, because it would be hard for me to see young white women wrestled to the ground like this in any situation by a police officer. What I can say here is Black feminism criticizes the treatment of Black girls as socially unjust. What it does is it looks at all of the situations and the social institutions where Black girls are seen as lesser, as other, where their opportunities are limited, their horizons shrink, and it says that is wrong. It is not merely descriptive of those practices. It is analytical and critical of those practices. But at the same time, Black feminism is critical for Black women. What do Black girls need to know in order to resist political domination? So there's an element of Black feminism that is talking about producing knowledge for people to help them protest, survive, and see who they are. And I start with children because children learn what we teach them. My presentation today is going to build on those basic ideas, because intersectionality emerges from Black feminism, so I'll be saying a bit about that. And it has two dimensions to it, because intersectionality criticizes power. Power. If there's no power in there anywhere, it's probably not intersectional. If it's all about identity, where people are saying things like, oh, my intersectional identity as a Black woman makes me cute and brilliant, well, maybe yes, maybe no, I'm not so sure. But where is the power? This is a discourse that talks about power relations as intersecting, and it criticizes them to give us conceptual and intellectual and political tools to analyze the power relations that affect our lives. That is what it is designed to do. And clearly, there are many people who hope and wish that that will fail. The second part of my presentation is very much targeted to this particular audience because I want to talk about intersectionality as criticizing epistemic power. This notion of power of ideas, how ideas themselves are sites of power. They're not just derivative of power relations in the real world. They have an energy of their own. So that's what we're going to do. Can I pause here for a moment and take a sip of water? I know this is very serious material, but I'm going to try and lighten up a little bit. I can be happier if you want, but it's hard to talk about, to do this work about changing deeply embedded systems of power and what it takes without being serious from time to time with some serious people, as you all are, I think. Well, okay, we're going to continue on. So moving into the first part, criticizing intersecting power relations. And here I want to talk about how two meanings of being critical matter. So I'm going to say a bit more about power itself and how it's organized. We're going to spend a little time on this slide, intersectional analyses of power, because what you see on this one slide is a miracle. I want you all to know you are witnessing a miracle. You can take your phones out and photograph this one slide, because this is, in a nutshell, what lies at the heart of intersectionality, intersectional analysis of power. Intersectionality investigates how race, class, gender, sexuality, age, ability, religion, and citizenship constitute intersecting systems of power that mutually construct one another. Now, what do I mean by that? Most of the time, people enter this work through one door. I entered critical work through the door of race. It was easy for me to see as a young person, because of the community that I lived in Philadelphia, that Black people were treated very badly. We had schools that weren't as good. We had less beneficial transportation. There were a variety of no hospitals in the neighborhood necessarily. And that seemed to be directly connected to race and racism. I didn't have to work hard to figure that out. And neither did the people in my community. So for me, walking through the door of race and saying, racism might have something to do with this, what exactly is racism? But when I started poking around and asking, what were the effects of racism on different people in my community, I noticed that racism had it was organized differently for men and for women, and for adults and for children, and for middle class and poor people. So that what happened was, I was, without knowing it, and before the creation of the word intersectionality, I knew that the solutions to the kinds of questions that I was asking and the social problems that I saw could not lie exclusively in analyses of racism that only took race into account and that did not in some way take gender, class, age, and other categories into account. What I did not know was that other people were entering that same political and intellectual space as I was through different doorways. There were many women who were not black women who were noticing things like violence against women and reproductive issues that affected women, issues that affected them because of their bodies and being in a body that was a female body. And coming through that door of gender, which became called the door of feminism in some ways, they encountered people in that space already who were thinking about race. So what began to happen was a discussion of race and class and gender in this shared space that no one knew existed because it wasn't assumed to be there. Each of these separate spaces had a history of its own, and we were conditioned to stay in those interpretive spaces, as well as the political spaces that they engendered. So the intersectional space was not named, but that did not mean it did not exist. People who entered intersectionality early on entered through doors of power and not through doors that were otherwise. So there was a predisposition to see how these categories constructed one another. That was the question. Wait a minute. What does race and gender have to do with one another if you are a white woman or a black woman or a young black male? How does that work? It wasn't finished, and it isn't finished to this day. Because what has happened with this particular field is the creation of a radical space where people have come from all of these different areas where they have been told they should stay, whether that is a space of ability, being able-bodied or not, or the space of religion, being in the good religion or not, and recognizing that we should talk to each other and that we no longer have to go through the centers of power that lie in those separate categories. Is this making sense? Yes or no? Just wave your yes, Seem? Okay, because I've never said this before, so I'm not quite sure how this makes sense or not. But if later on, if you would tell me, maybe in the question and answer period, and just let me know. But this first piece about investigating how race, class, gender, that first bullet point is the big one. Coming together within intersectional spaces to talk about power relations, not just to commiserate with one another, but to resist them. That's why people were there to begin with, not to find recognition for shared suffering, but to develop an analysis and an agenda for thinking through and responding to these challenges. And what came out of that was greater attention to examining how social inequalities and social problems that these systems of power engendered are organized, endure, change, and resisted. I list here violence as a social problem. Now, many people think of violence as just basic to human nature, and it doesn't have anything to do with power relations. Some people are more inherently violent than others. Men are more inherently violent than women because of more testosterone. I don't adhere to any of those. That's another discussion for other people. I think violence is the face of power. So racial violence is the face of racism. Gender violence is the face of sexism. Violence against young people is the face of violence against the young to keep them in place. So basically, what intersectionality enabled was the beginning of new conversations about social inequalities and social problems. We could begin to have conversations around shared social problems that were differently experienced. Much of the early work in intersectionality was about violence. That's what got people through that door in the first place, some aspect of violence. But when they got through the door, they realized how important violence was to maintaining social inequality, to making you go to the place where you're supposed to belong, and to shaping the social problems that we all experienced. But one more thing came out of this that I think is very important to acknowledge. Distinctive political struggles are interconnected within a broader struggle for social justice. The intersectional space argues that there are multiple struggles for social justice. Some wear the face of race, some the face of class, some the face of gender, some are far away. But the bottom line is that they are interconnected in some way. We don't have to collapse one group's struggle into that of another in order to move forward with a project. Okay. Let's move on to the next one. I think I'm in trouble. I'm on slide 8, and I can feel my voice beginning to go. Let's all take a breath. Take a breath, take a breath, take a breath. Please breathe, breathe, breathe. For me, get more air in the room. Wave your hands around for me, please, please. I need air. Up here. All right, I'm taking water. That should help. And now I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit. All right. So when it comes to intersectionality, critical of, within this box of criticizing intersecting power relations, last week I gave you an example of how intersectionality was critical of authoritarian political communities. I presented an argument of how authoritarianism, which many of us think is true, teaches us to see the world in us-them frameworks. We are the good people, they are the bad people. We must stick together and keep them out of our communities, out of our schools, out of our neighborhoods, out of our families. No, we can't have that. We believe in sameness, and we all have to do the same thing. So without going more into that, and this particular graphic, for those of you who were not here last week, is the graphic of, in the United States, the conflation of the Confederate flag with the American flag. The people in the United States who claim the American flag as their own, but what they are in fact presenting is the Confederate flag, which is the flag of white supremacy, the side that lost the Civil War, but that apparently has difficulty recognizing that to this day. But that's critical of. Academics have done a terrific job of criticizing, through an intersectional framework, authoritarian political communities. But the other question of critical for, what can intersectionality do for political projects? How can it be meaningful in a way for people who are involved in social justice projects, similar to how Black feminist thought is meaningful for Black women? And last week I also presented an alternative to authoritarianism, which is the framework of participatory democracy. And what I presented last week was equality through respect for differences. This is a very different kind of equality than through sameness. We all must pretend to be the same and imagine ourselves as the same. It is recognizing that there is space for difference and that is the strength of a political community, not its weakness or its downfall. This is a view that recognizes that citizen participation strengthens the political community. Intersectionality can say a lot to groups that are trying to work with one another within these types of projects. And it cultivates talent through recognition of diversity, inclusivity, and equity. So, the question, and as I go through the talk, I don't have answers for a lot of my questions. They are the questions we should be asking. So for intersectionality to retain and sharpen its critical edge, how does it speak to these democratic projects? Is it simply criticizing what's there, or is it presenting alternatives? Next one. And I have two areas that I brought up really quickly, and I'm going to go through this quickly because I want to get to the second part of the talk. The first is intersectionality and community organizing. I have to keep going, or it will not make sense to you. Bear with me. Can you bear with me? How are we doing? I have to check in. Let me stand up for a minute and look at you. Oh, okay. How are we doing? How about over here? Doing okay? Because, you know, I do not come here to put people to sleep. I can put myself to sleep quite well by myself, all right? It's known as go home and get in the bed. How about this section over here? Are you thinking? Are you thinking about intersectionality as a critical discourse? And how it's not enough to just criticize the badness of authoritarian politics of one's own country. But it's important to offer people alternative ways of thinking about doing politics. And alternative ways of thinking about doing politics that speak to the questions that are important to them. You still with me? How about this little section over here? How about the sleeping people over here? You in the back row back there, are you up yet? I see you, right? You knew who I was too. Wait a minute, is that Pop? Is that Papa? Is that Paulo? It is. You were sleeping during my talk? Oh, I feel bad. Didn't know I knew names, did you? Now you're worried. Okay, back to the talk. I think we've dealt with you all enough here today. I'm sitting back down for a few minutes. Then I'll get back up in a minute too. All right. Okay. Intersectionality and community organizing. Basically, community organizing is the bedrock of politics. It is the way that people who have a shared identity and experiences come together to solve social problems. They recognize in one another that they are part of a community where things happen to you. And these systems of power, racism, heteropatriarchy, and nationalism, cannot be solved by individuals. The power of these intersecting power relations merits collective response. So, how might the ideas of intersectionality inform these kinds of projects? And how might the ideas and actions of community organizing inform intersectionality? Now, last week, I had the wonderful experience of going to Pimentas, Cursino Comunitario. Am I close? Was that kind of close? I know it was bad, but I try, all right. And it was a wonderful afternoon. This is a program that is clearly community organizing. I could just sit there and say, from tip to toe, the entire afternoon was community organizing. This is us looking all smiling, you know, near the end, as opposed to the running around that was going on, including the cachorro, who was right in the middle. Woof, woof, that. All right. But community organizing is around shared experiences, shared identities, and shared social issues. And the most effective communities have a shared social issue that builds solidarity among people. This particular program is a Saturday and Sunday school where high school students come to prepare for the exam that I believe many of you had to take to get into college. How many of you actually went to a school like this to help you prepare? Could you raise your hand? There's one person there. Yes. Oh, there we are. Now they're confessing. All right, put your hands up. This is really, really important because this form of community organizing, the way this works is people volunteer their time on Saturday and Sunday to work with high school students to help them pass the exam, to be able to come to school, to then go back and also volunteer in the space. And what happens is an intergenerational network of political organizing. I believe this school's been in existence for 20 years, which is a fair amount of time to do this kind of work without a budget. So when you are armed with the power of ideas, and it's amazing what can happen. The parents were there cooking for the high school students. And I want to tell you, lunch was yummy. Almuerzo, boom, all right. But the issue here is this work can be joyous in community spaces. It can be hard work. These students were studying hard. I went in the library and I wanted to see what books they were using. These exams are no joke. If you've taken them, you know that. But the assumption that kids from Pimentas could not pass this exam, and that is why they were not in universities. This school said, or this community organizing project said, we are going to organize to refute that, to resist that set of ideas. So I was very impressed by that because communities often form the basis of political action, whether it is around a shared social issue like educational access, or if it is around a tragedy like police violence. And you know you cannot solve this by yourself. So I felt that I visited a very creative and committed community space. And any of you who are affiliated with Cursino Comentario, if you would let them know that I mentioned them in this lecture and appreciate their hosting me for the afternoon, all right? But I want to move on to a second type of politics, which is intersectionality and coalition politics. Because this is related but different. Coalition politics among individuals and groups in response to a shared social issue. So let's say the shared social issue is education and educational access, but it doesn't have to come from one community. Cursino can work coalitions with other similar projects or with other groups that are concerned about education, or a coalition can be just a group of individuals very different from one another, very different backgrounds, who form an alliance and a coalition. So the question here is, how might the ideas of intersectionality inform coalition politics? Because this is the kind of politics that elite groups hate. They're happy if one group comes at a time, particularly one group that they're used to dealing with. But if two groups come, and three groups come, and those groups aren't just talking to the elite group, but they're talking to each other, that is very threatening. This is back to entering through the door of intersectionality and finding others in that shared space who share your concerns. How might the ideas of coalition politics inform intersectionality? I should have said, and how might the ideas and actions of community organizing inform intersectionality? So to sum up this part of the talk, I don't see how intersectionality will sharpen its critical edge without paying additional attention to politics on the ground. It's not enough to criticize in the academy. It's not enough to just take on the ideas and say, that's enough. I think the discourse itself will be impoverished if it's not paying attention to what it's critical of and who it's critical for. So now let's move on. Let's skip the next slide. and move on to the next one. Criticizing epistemic power. Here I'm going to talk a little bit about just some of the core ideas of the book where I decided to take this on. I decided, rather than complaining about intersectionality and how everyone was using the term quite loosely for their own purposes, I was going to ask, is intersectionality a critical social theory? And if so, what kind? And at the center of my analysis was going to be an understanding of what it means to be critical. I had to write a book that talked both about being critical of ideas, but also how ideas can empower. If you do the kind of work that empowers people, that is a real gift to get to that place. So anyhow, epistemic power. Let me just say a bit about this, because my sense is that everyone in this room has already run into a lot of epistemic power, and from here on is going to continue to encounter epistemic power, because it is all about, such power is all about hierarchy, but it's all about ideas. Power relations are built into both the content of knowledge and the processes of knowledge production. It's pretty easy. Well, it's not easy, but it's more straightforward to find the ways in which the content of what you've been taught may or may not be accurate. The content may simply be a lie, for example. Oh, has it ever occurred to you that what we're taught as truth might be a lie? Ooh, yes or no? Okay, let's just ponder that for a little bit. Let's ponder that concept, all right? And how one comes to notice that what you are being taught is either incomplete, partial, biased, skewed, or just plain wrong. And then when you are critical of it, you are told, oh no, you're too young, you don't know enough, it's not your field, or whatever. Now, I used to think this was the problem of being young. No one's listening to me because I'm young, kind of thing. And when I age out of being young and I know more stuff, then I will have power. Well, it's really interesting, because recognizing that the processes of knowledge production that are all around us are the exercise of epistemic power. What questions are important and which are not? What counts as evidence and what does not? What is a convincing argument and what is not? Which audiences matter and which do not? Who is permitted to do intellectual work and who is not? This lies at the heart of epistemic power, the ability of ideas to control, even though on their own, people who are doing this may not even notice because it's so natural and so normal. Let me give you an example. I think I want to get into the Wayback Machine. No, I don't want to get in the Wayback Machine yet. I want to get into the senior status, surprise, surprise, part of my life, all right, and say, when I moved to the University of Maryland and I entered my department as a full professor, I was the only black woman full professor in the department, 30 people. There was one white woman and everybody was scared of her, and I loved her immediately. She was wonderful, all right? And there was one black man who I did not get along with because he felt he should tell me what to do. He was quite comfortable with norms of black masculinity, which were to help and support. It was very paternalistic. He meant well, but all he did was aggravate me, right? Now, I'm in a faculty meeting and I say something, blah, 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 blah. Silence. Someone else says something, blah, 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 blah. Someone else says something, and of course the meeting is white men. There's nothing wrong with being a white man, but this is the situation I was in. 2 people down, a white man says exactly what I had just said that had not been responded to, and all of a sudden people sprang to life like, my God, you're a genius. Blah, 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 blue, 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 blah, blah, blah. I sat there and I listened to this and I said, well, I can do what normally happens, which is we just say, maybe if I'm a better professor, they'll be nicer to me next time. But what I had experienced was a really classic test case of epistemic power, of using the rules to control what the questions will be, what will be discussed, what will be convincing evidence, who will be listened to, who will be not be, who the audiences are that we should pay attention to. I'm sorry to the people who are translating. I forgot. I kind of got into the rhythm of the moment. Pause, pause, pause. Okay. So this whole situation of being ignored and not heard, I think is really important because some people have the power to simply ignore you and not listen to you and not consider you to be important at all. And the fact that this can happen on high levels, as I was desegregating this unit, that's what was going on. They simply weren't used to having a person like me there. By this time, I was pretty uppity, and I interrupted the meeting. Such a shock. I interrupted the meeting to discuss or to name what had just happened. I said, excuse me, but com licença. No, I wasn't speaking Portuguese then. It was still in English. Did you not hear what I said a few minutes ago? Because it sounds very much like what so-and-so just said. And of course, everyone was greatly embarrassed by that situation. Because what I had pointed out to them were the unwritten rules that they were using in terms of who is listened to and who is not. And how that affected the outcome of that meeting, which was the knowledge we were creating in that meeting. Now, if you can understand that meeting, you can understand the broader processes of epistemic power, where they will be hidden in who gets to be published and who isn't, who gets jobs and who doesn't, who gets into schools and who doesn't get into those schools, how people are treated once they are in those schools. Many of this has nothing to do with the niceness or the evilness of the individuals. It's the social structures that we are in. The structures of power, intersecting systems of power, and how they shape what counts as knowledge. That's what intersectionality is intervening in. So just to give you a little bit of sort of my little, not little, but my, epic battle, that's how I would describe it, in terms of education, writing, publishing, and somehow I've made it to this stage with a piece of my voice, un pedazo pequeño of my voice, but I'm going to use it as long as I can. Next slide. Writing Black feminist thought. It was all about this. It wasn't necessarily about Black women. I knew I was on solid ground with what I studied, the techniques that I used, the questions, what counted as evidence, I was actually more thorough because I had to have what counted as evidence for black women and what counted as evidence for the academy. But the question of how to confront epistemic power, the rules that were built in, the rules themselves, was the challenge. How was I going to navigate writing that book so it stayed true to black women who could recognize themselves in the book, and it was scholarly enough to get published, and also to help me keep my job. Now, I tell people I didn't start writing Black feminist thought until after I had tenure. Everybody thinks it was my dissertation. Nope. My dissertation was all about the things that are in Black feminist thought without saying black women. Too much of a red flag at that point. Nope. When I wrote Black feminist thought, I recognized I was confronting epistemic power. And I had to first find a way to make sure that black women would recognize themselves in the book, that the evidence that I was producing, the argument that I was making would ring true to them. So I asked my students. At the time, I was teaching African American studies, and I corralled 4 of my undergraduate students, 4 young, really intelligent, on the ball and different from one another, young black women. And I said, will you read a chapter for me? Now I knew the publisher was going to send the book out to scholarly readers, most of whom would not be black, maybe not even women, but who would be reading for those tried and true standards of scholarship, which I met, but who would be predisposed not to like my argument because they just didn't believe this audience was important. But I decided I would write my audience into my book, so I sent them home with a chapter. And I said, don't tell me what to fix. Just tell me what you think when you read this chapter. And I sent them home with a chapter on mothering and mother work. And they came back, and one young woman said to me, that is exactly what my grandma says. That reminded me so much of my aunt, I cannot believe it. They were telling me that I was speaking the truth of black women's lives, even though that truth wasn't necessarily in the language all the time that black women used. So I had to figure out the translation between that and getting it into print. And from there, I think I mentioned to you the challenges once things got into print. And from there, making sure the book didn't disappear. Well, this particular story has a very happy, quote, ending, because the first, on the far left, you see Black feminist thought the way it looked in 1990. That was the cover graphic. Black feminist thought. My students came to me and said, people are stopping us on the bus and asking us what this is. We've never heard of anything like this. What is this? One woman said, this one guy came up to me and said, oh, I hate what's in that book. And she said, well, have you read the book? He said, no, I don't have to read the book. I just know I hate it. Now, this is a very interesting climate to work in, because when you're confronting epistemic power from outside, but also around you, it's good. So I was quite happy with the cover because it was doing work I couldn't do. But then I'm pointing out to you across the bottom the different editions of the book, one of which I'm very happy with, which is the Portuguese translation. I was extremely excited when it was translated into Portuguese. And then the most recent, which is the 30th anniversary edition. So this book has legs and staying power. And I think one reason is because I had to think through very carefully. Too much head moving, sorry. okay, very carefully, the situation of epistemic power. I couldn't ignore the conditions that made my work possible. Now, a lot of academics do that. They just assume if their ideas are good, people will just find them and say, wow, you're fabulous. I had no such guarantee. And this is the nature of critical projects, being critical of and being critical for. Okay, I don't want to dwell on this too much. I can come back to this and you can ask me about it in terms of how that worked with Black feminist thought, but basically epistemic power operates by making you, taking away from you the power of your own agency, agents of knowledge, and turning you into objects of knowledge, things that can be studied by other people who are smarter than you, who have more education than you. So what I was doing in Black feminist thought was challenging that entire system, not overtly, because that would be not to get published, but certainly, if you can read the subtext, you can find plenty of that in there. Now, writing intersectionality is a different path, because intersectionality comes from Black feminist thought, but it had no name. But epistemic power is just as important. So here I want to tell you this quick story about, I'd say, 15 years of intersectionality, which becomes named in 1990, but just dawdles along there peacefully for quite some time, until 2015 or so, when all of a sudden the term takes off. Now, this is really interesting to me. Why does a term take off at a certain point in time? And how does it take off? Well, in the US, it's, quite frankly, I want to say, how can I say this nicely? Many people on the far right recognize the power of the term. They were asleep at the wheel. They hadn't noticed 15 years of coalition politics that went into the making of this particular term. And at the bottom, whoopsie, oh, there's more. Oh, next slide, I'm so sorry. This is me. We should be here, sorry. Now, all the things I just said, pretend I didn't say them. Now remember them, and there they are, and now I'm pointing at the books on the bottom, okay? I know it's hard to forget something and remember something you forgot. I mean, I understand how hard this is, but you look pretty smart. All right, so what I had been doing since 1990 was confronting epistemic power through the discourse of intersectionality without it being known as such. Down at the far left, I'm picking up where I stopped off that prior slide. Black feminist thought was well established. Black feminist thought becomes translated into other languages. But I want to point to the book in the middle, which is called Race, Class, and Gender. It is a green cover, and it's the book that traverses this entire period. During a 20-year period, my co-author and I, each 3 years, revised an undergraduate textbook called Race, Class, and Gender, which is, by the way, in US universities where the money is, textbooks are very lucrative. Now, less so now than in the past, so publishers like doing them. And what we did every 3 years was we assembled the best work that we could find that seemed to be talking to each other around race, class, gender, and then increasingly sexuality, nation, and ethnicity. So what we did in a methodical way was not just imagine intersectionality as falling from the sky, but laying a foundation for this work and for this way of working. Once it became named and took off, we were on a much firmer foundation to talk about this field as critical and knowing how it had evolved as critical. And of course, the intersectionality books, because I figured, well, I now need to write a book about intersectionality and not just about race, class, and gender. And that's what I've been doing. I'll tell you a bit more about that in a minute. So anyhow, to begin to wrap up, I'm just going to put this up here and come back to it next week. But intersectionality as critical social theory is what the book, Not Just Ideas, is all about. I'm leaving out a lot because my voice is going. Next slide. But basically, the core questions that I engage in this book are, the core question, what makes intersectionality a critical social theory? Why does intersectionality exist? What is the relationship between critical inquiry and critical praxis? Critical of what? Critical for who? And I also lay out intersectionality's cognitive architecture. So when you get to that book down the road, I wouldn't start with this one, but I would definitely aim for this one. And you're doing your, basically, I don't know, down the road intellectual work, you're writing dissertations and things beyond that. This is the kind of book that will give you an analysis that can be critical of existing social theory, but also critical for the kind of social theory that you might want to do. It is a set of tools for people who are engaged in these types of intellectual battles with epistemic power. So this is a book to take with you as you think through epistemic power and how it works. I think I want to go to the next one, then I want to, next one, next week, final one, here we are. So, to sum up, you have just survived. I want to point out this to you. You have survived one of the more challenging lectures that I will give. The material was complex. It required of you thinking about how to put your own project in what I was saying. It pointed out to you the importance of doing work that is important to you. It pointed out the pitfalls and the dangers of doing intellectual work. And it also argued that you cannot be out of touch with people who are doing political work, saying that ideas don't matter, they're just off to the side. What I have argued today is that ideas are at the center of all of this. They are at the center of power relations. I take them seriously. I encourage you to take them seriously. And what I would very much like is to see you next week so we can wrap this up. Thank you.
Muito obrigada, Patrícia. Eu preciso dar um recado que eu esqueci de dar no começo, que é o seguinte, tem uma lista passando por aí, uma lista de presença, eu pediria que vocês todos assinassem, porque nós precisamos dessa lista, primeiro, para emitir os certificados de quem se inscreveu no curso, segundo, para prestar conta do aluguel do equipamento de tradução simultânea. Bom, é isso. E agora eu passo a palavra para a Marta, que vai fazer alguns comentários e vai dar um pontapé inicial nas perguntas.
Boa noite. Gente, é assim, minha cabeça está fervendo. Vamos começar pelo começo, então. Vou até levantar um pouquinho para a energia, né? Bom, meu nome é Marta Celestino, eu sou CEO da Ebony English, eu sou Yalorixá, iniciada em Orixá há pouco mais de 20 anos, iniciada por Orixá Ogum, que é um vanguardista, que foi um vanguardista, enfim, e é uma honra estar aqui no ambiente acadêmico, no espaço acadêmico. Eu não pude terminar o meu mestrado, adivinha por quê, né? Systemic Racism, mas eu gosto de pesquisar, gosto de ler, gosto de estudar, eu tenho hábito de filosofar, eu me chamo de pensadora, e a minha companheira de trabalho aí é a Adriana, que aqui está, a professora Ellen, que me convidou. E, Miss Collins, I'm in trouble, because you made my mind just shake. Então, é assim, desde a semana passada, vim aqui acompanhar os pensamentos de Patricia Hill Collins, e tenho pensado da perspectiva de matriz africana, e eu vou tentar não me alongar muito, apesar da complexidade do assunto. Como é que são essas relações de poder? Como é que é a interseccionalidade a partir do candomblé? Estou falando do candomblé porque eu sou iniciada no candomblé, sou iniciada em Ifá, mas matriz africana não é só candomblé, em termos de religião. Então, eu preciso falar algumas coisas importantes. A primeira coisa importante apesar de ser religião de matriz africana, não é só religião que ali dentro acontece. A própria forma como o candomblé foi criado no Brasil é uma colmeia de culturas, é uma colmeia de saberes, de práticas religiosas, de liturgia, de práticas culturais e filosóficas que se juntou aqui, se juntou na América Latina toda e nas ilhas do Caribe, acredito eu, fora do continente, por causa da diáspora, por causa desse sequestro que foi feito. Só que a gente não chegou aqui vazio, né? Os nossos ancestrais não chegaram aqui vazios. Então, nós construímos coisas novas. Nós adaptamos palavras, adaptamos vocabulários e adaptamos a nossa liturgia também. Mas o que talvez não estivesse tão organizado, como está mais recentemente, é a ideia de que o candomblé em si é uma organização política. E fundamentalmente interseccional, a partir do momento em que as mulheres do candomblé, por que eu digo as mulheres? Porque o candomblé só chegou aqui hoje como ele é, porque as mulheres são as guardiãs do segredo, por N razões. Pela própria violência, que mata o homem negro mais rápido, de forma mais cruel, que envenena, que embebeda, que encarcera, né? Então, a mulher negra, que era a empregada doméstica, assim como era minha mãe, que era a ama de leite, que era a faxineira, ela pôde, apesar de toda a opressão, manter o conhecimento e passar gerações e gerações do benzimento, da folha, da água, do orixá, mesmo embaixo do sincretismo. E a gente volta a falar de poder aí. Eu quero muito depois voltar e dar uma pincelada nessa palavra poder dentro das relações que a religião de matriz africana construiu através desses anos todos aqui. Então, depois de toda essa construção, o que acontece é que nós somos a primeira religião, né, a acolher todas as pessoas dentro dos seus micro-universos, na nossa comunidade. Então, o que me encanta como Yalorixá? Uma coisa que me encanta como Yalorixá é justamente a ideia de que eu posso, a partir do jogo de búzios, do oráculo, ler uma pessoa enquanto um indivíduo e todo o universo que esse indivíduo é, e, a partir daquela leitura, receitar um remédio, que a gente chama ebó de remédio, é como ir ao médico, né? Então, a parte mística, ela existe. Mas, na verdade, nós somos uma sociedade de químicos e de matemáticos, porque nós trabalhamos química, e nós trabalhamos a matemática através dos odus, e nós trabalhamos psicologia, porque as pessoas chegam no candomblé querendo palavras, querendo resolver os problemas delas, e a gente não resolve de forma mágica, né? São esses remédios, é esse convívio social, né? Eu fui para o candomblé para uma casa profundamente matriarcal. A minha falecida Yalorixá era uma mulher negra alta, com uma voz muito forte, muito mandona, porque mulher preta é mandona, né? Muito mandona, só que ela não entendia muito bem o que era esse negócio de racismo, culturalmente falando, né? Na cabeça dela, ela falava, não, a gente vive numa democracia racial. mas tanto eu quanto a Adriana, que aqui está, fomos levando política para dentro da casa. Eu era militante no movimento hip-hop, militante no movimento negro, e a gente foi politizando esse ambiente, né? Então, o que acontece é que a gente começou, mesmo sem aquilo estar tão organizado como os pensamentos de Dr. Collins, aquilo não estava tão organizado, mas a gente conseguia entender que a gente fazia política, que a gente tratava de feminismo, quando a gente juntava aquele monte de mulher preta, tudo mãe solteira, tudo empregada doméstica, ou a maioria, sabe? Pessoas que queriam ir para a universidade, mas que não se viam naquele espaço. Lésbicas. Era uma casa matriarcal, tinha pouquíssimos homens, acho que a gente era 98% de mulheres, né? A gente teve filhos homens, mas assim, quem chegou com a gente eram mulheres. Então, era muita intersecção, era gente morando em favela. Então, era muita gente junto ali, buscando uma coisa só: equilíbrio. Que a gente pode ler como justiça social, porque a gente queria estudar, a gente queria trabalhar e ganhar igual aos nossos colegas brancos, né? A gente queria estudar, eu mesma fui para a universidade com a ideia de fazer mestrado e doutorado depois, e as pessoas falavam: o quê? Sério mesmo? Eu falava: isso é o que eu quero, né? Então, o candomblé no Brasil e as religiões de matriz africana têm um papel político muito forte, especialmente dentro das comunidades, que é onde a gente alimenta aquela comunidade, né? Então, a gente vê, por exemplo, as religiões tradicionais que têm matança animal, né, que é o sacrifício animal, tudo lá é regulamentado. O do candomblé é demonizado. E aí a raça vem antes. Então, vocês veem quantas coisas a gente trabalha dentro do candomblé. A gente trabalha raça, a gente trabalha gênero, a gente trabalha expressão de gênero, mais atualmente. A gente trabalha a questão da geração e manutenção da riqueza geracional, desde que o candomblé foi constituído, porque muitas mulheres, comunidades de candomblé, se organizavam até então para comprar alforria, por exemplo, de algumas pessoas, né? Então, é muito importante a gente receber uma pesquisadora como Patricia Hill Collins, falando de interseccionalidade, de poder, a gente, como povo de santo, para entender o nosso papel nesta sociedade tão mestiça, tão sincretizada, onde a mesma pessoa que demoniza vai lá para tirar ebó, vai lá para pedir conselho, vai lá porque o médico não achou a doença, então ele vai lá no químico de matriz africana, ele vai lá no médico de matriz africana, porque ninguém achou a doença que o filho dele tinha, mas ele não pode falar para ninguém. Isso é um apagamento, né? É o epistemicídio do conhecimento científico, mesmo que seja fora da academia. Então, a gente volta a esse assunto sobre como confrontar, né, esse conhecimento que está aí reconhecido pela academia. O candomblé faz isso há séculos. Justamente desse jeito. Quando ninguém achou o problema, a pessoa foi lá no candomblé, tirou um ebó, melhorou, e ninguém explica como. Ninguém sabe explicar como. E a gente é tido como pessoas místicas, como coisas intangíveis, inexplicáveis. Só que a própria física fala, né, que não é porque você não vê que não está aqui. Então, quem somos nós? Agora, falando de poder, né, não dá para se alongar muito, eu fiquei pensando muito nessa palavra poder, enquanto Patricia Hill Collins falava, e tenho pensado um pouco nisso. Quando a gente sai do continente nesse sequestro, as palavras mudaram de significado. Antes do poder, a palavra mãe mudou de significado. Então, eu estou chamando mãe antes, porque se a gente chegou aqui hoje, enquanto matriz africana, foi por causa de nós, mulheres, que assumimos uma maternidade social, que não é a maternidade de quem tem filho e pariu, não é isso que eu estou falando. É de ser mãe social e acolher muitos que a sociedade rejeita, através dessas relações de poder, né? Então, se você não faz parte daquele grupo, aquele que falou: ó, eu não quero esse assim, pela sexualidade dele, pela cor dele, etc, 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 o candomblé acolhe. E quem acolheu foram as mães de santo. E dissemos o seguinte: são meus filhos. Porque a Yalorixá, ela não fala outra coisa, ela fala assim: esse é meu filho de santo. Às vezes, até os nossos filhos sentindo ciúme, mas a gente fala: esse aqui é o meu filho de santo. E a gente põe para casa, a gente acolhe, e é bêbado, e é drogado, e não interessa, é meu filho de santo. Isso é uma coisa da mulher africana, de ser uma mãe social. Não é caridade. é assumir responsabilidade social de ajudar, e de ajudar no sentido de vamos rumo ao progresso. Isso é uma coisa de matriz africana, especialmente das mulheres, muito forte. A outra coisa é a relação de poder. Quando a gente está no continente, quando a gente volta a conversar e pensar em filosofia africana, o que é poder para uma pessoa iniciada em orixá, independente da nação que ela esteja? Poder é ser invencível. Poder é não morrer. Poder é ter a sua cultura, a garantia de ter uma cultura viva, de ter um legado, de ser uma memória. Quando a gente vem para cá, para o Ocidente, poder vira o quê? Subjugar. Se eu te subjugo, eu sou poderoso, eu sou melhor do que você. Isso não cabe em matriz africana. Não é que nós não temos problema. Não é que nós não vivenciemos situações de reprodução desse tipo de autoritarismo, né? Desse tipo de relação de poder distorcida. Mas o que nos fez sobreviver até aqui, enquanto organização político-social, organizada para um futuro, é justamente a percepção do nosso legado. E olha como o opressor sabe disso. Ele sabe quando? Quando ele apaga a nossa história, e a gente tem um monte de rua com o nome de bandeirante. Todo dia eu sou obrigada a cultuar o ancestral daquele que matou meu povo. Quando eu falo a rua, a estátua do Borba Gato, o que eu estou falando? Eu estou cultuando, né, o ancestral deles através do nome da rua. Por isso que a placa da Marielle foi quebrada no meio, porque vai cultuar o nome dessa mulher. Eles sabem. Isso daí é milimetricamente planejado para nos tirar o que é mais caro, que é o poder que vem dos nossos ancestrais. E eu não estou falando de religião, eu estou falando de identidade, de saber quem somos, de saber de onde viemos, porque isso aqui nos dá o rumo que a gente busca enquanto pessoas dissidentes de várias filosofias africanas que têm total e completa condição, reitero aqui, de liderar uma nova ordem mundial. E eu nem estou falando de política no sentido de blocos políticos, não é isso. Nova ordem mundial de humanidade. Uma humanidade que entenda justiça, né, equidade, como algo fundamental para a sociedade global. Então, assim, fronteira, não fui eu que inventei, não fomos nós que inventamos. Quem inventou fronteira? A quem interessa ter fronteira? A quem interessa que um imigrante seja ilegal? Por que a imigração é ilegal? Porque a cultura que dá liberdade de pensar, que dá liberdade de existir enquanto indivíduo para alguém, é uma cultura rechaçada. Tudo que dá poder ao povo é rechaçado. E o candomblé dá poder ao povo, dá autonomia. Quando a gente é sacerdote, fala, você é responsável pela sua vida. Você está vindo aqui, eu estou te orientando, mas o responsável por conseguir as coisas é você. Claro, a gente tem uma parcela de religião na gente, e é a nossa humanidade, que é quando você ajoelha e fala, Exu, me abre o caminho, e você pede, porque Exu é nosso ancestral. Ora, bolas, nós temos direito de ter um ancestral, sabe? Então, Miss Collins me fez pensar nessas relações de poder, e me fez pensar muito na distorção das palavras, na nossa vida e na nossa prática fora do continente. Então, eu tenho trabalhado há um tempo para conectar as pessoas da diáspora. Por que eu sou CEO da Ebony English? Por que inglês? Mas é a língua Yankee. Mas é a língua que, uma das línguas, junto com o francês e com o espanhol, que pode, antes do Swahili, que pode nos aproximar do continente. A gente pode se falar melhor, a gente pode trocar experiências, a gente pode trocar, inclusive, experiências de organização social, pensando nesse futuro. E eu me arrisco a dizer o seguinte, que o encontro da diáspora é o primeiro encontro antes da diáspora com a África. Porque a África também sofre de colonialismo. Mas e o que tem a ver a África com religião? Tudo. A África é o berço do mundo. Eu acredito que ali a gente tem condição de encontrar muitos elementos que possam e que já nos dão respostas para várias perguntas que a gente tem. Se eu fosse endereçar uma pergunta à Patricia Hill Collins agora, nem sei se eu posso endereçar uma pergunta, mas eu diria o seguinte: esses estudos sobre interseccionalidade e todas as outras coisas que a senhora trouxe aqui, pensamento feminista negro, política, democracia, são estudos para lá de importantes, especialmente para a comunidade negra, que muitas vezes não se vê num espaço de poder desta forma, com o poder da palavra, e muito menos com o poder de desenvolver uma teoria, né? Então, são estudos muito importantes feitos por uma mulher negra, por pessoas negras, dentro do espaço acadêmico. E talvez a gente possa pensar que estudar, por exemplo, interseccionalidade, hoje, e estruturas de poder, pode ser realmente o que a gente precisa para nos organizar para entrar nesse futuro, já que a gente pratica a interseccionalidade dentro do espaço do terreiro, de forma tão natural, né, respeitando a forma como o candomblé e as religiões de matriz africana foram constituídos no Brasil. Não seria esse, então, o nosso driver para oficializar não somente a capacidade do povo de terreiro de produzir material acadêmico, de produzir política pública de qualidade, né, com muita propriedade, né, pensando nesse futuro justo e igualitário, não seria esse estudo um precursor desse encontro da diáspora e da nossa capacidade de se organizar frente a um futuro? Bom, enfim, eu queria falar mais um monte de coisa, mas não dá. É isso, gente. Obrigada pela atenção.
I think I would just say that, well, thank you. Since I know I'm going to see you this weekend, I'm going to save some questions for then, but I think you really touch on you touch on many important points, but I just want to talk about this last one. To me, intersectionality, what's funny about now is all of these groups that are realizing, but that's what we've been trying to do without having the word. So somehow, the word intersectionality should help, but if it doesn't help, if what it does is enable people to say, but we're trying to be more inclusive. And here's what went through my mind. It's really basic. Your freedom cannot be predicated upon somebody else's domination. If you keep it that simple, and basically as sort of the rule of thumb within political organizations or religious or quasi-religious organizations, it's a way of saying, but this policy that we're proposing that we want to see, in what ways does it empower us, but at what cost to other people? So it's a way of looking at the connectedness of different projects and different groups and different individuals, always looking at the connectedness, not looking for a common humanity, which I certainly believe is there, but also looking for a commonality in our politics, where in some ways we are more respectful of others because we know we're being held to the standard of not intersectionality per se, but we're being held to that standard of, that ethical standard of social justice that fundamentally says, if we're going to become empowered black women, it can't be at the expense of black men or vice versa. Or it cannot be at the expense of LGBT people, or it cannot be at the expense of indigenous people. This may be wonderful for us, but not so great for them. So it just opens all these doors to the kinds of conversations that aren't going through the power at the top, but are basically among the groups who are differently disempowered and struggling with these issues and drawing upon different resources as they do so. Because as you describe the significance of the African diaspora and then the African worldview, cosmology, philosophy, there's a lot going on there that is being rediscovered, I think, among many African groups. I mean, it's a huge continent with lots of different groups and whatever. So this is very difficult to sort of generalize, right? But I tell you, the work is moving in the right direction. And they have their own issues too with their own youth, who can be lost, to Western ways, in ways that are most upsetting because you are at the source and your child is not, kind of thing. So, I'm really, the more I learn, the more I come, the more I'm just, the more I'm very respectful and happy that I've come and gotten a chance to just hear just a short amount of time that you had. But when you said it may not be visible, but that doesn't mean it's not there, that I think is another big idea to carry people forward. Whether it's power, just because you can't see it doesn't mean it's not affecting on you in a negative way. Or this notion of power, this alternative view of power that you presented is very intriguing to me. I'm just going to let you know. You jumped like it was not a throwaway for you, but you were just comfortable talking about this. Oh, to be invincible, not dying, to assure a legacy, to assure a memory. Stop it. Okay, sorry, I had to yell at that for a minute. It just started making strange noises. I think that's because your ideas were so powerful. It affected the electricity, all right, in my machine. All right. But the question of power doesn't have to be subjugation. Power can be, this is to me, this spoke directly to the whole notion of critical for. Coming up with alternative notions of power, coming from various traditions, where people can have a vision of what it means to be powerful and to be empowered. And that is, we're far away from that, honestly. We're dealing with 500 years of significant history, to really push back against. But that doesn't mean if what you say may not be visible, but that doesn't mean it's not there. So I'm just going to take that home with me. And I'll cite you, but I'm tempted to claim it as my own, but I'll cite you.
Bom, agora nós vamos abrir para 5 perguntas, as 5 pessoas que chegarem aqui primeiro. Aqui no canto, por favor. Hoje a gente vai ter que limitar também, por conta do estado de saúde da convidada. Você quer começar?
Olá, boa noite. Meu nome é Tamires. Eu sou mãe da Olivia, a criança que... Meu nome é Tamires, eu sou estudante do curso de Ciências Sociais, mãe da criança que estava correndo aí pelo teatro aqui. E, assim, na verdade, eu não tenho uma pergunta específica, mas eu gostaria que a senhora fizesse um comentário sobre uma percepção que eu tenho enquanto mãe solo, mãe sozinha, dentro desse espaço universitário. Fala oi para a Patrícia.
Oi.
Deixa a mãe fazer a pergunta, tá? Que é a seguinte, eu percebo que nesse contexto político neoliberal, racista, principalmente nesse contexto do terceiro mundo, ter filhos, ao contrário da cultura iorubá que diz que nossos filhos são prosperidade, são nossos ancestrais que retornam, são motivo de festa e de alegria nas nossas vidas, essa sociedade, esse pensamento ocidental diz que os nossos filhos, na verdade, são empecilhos aos nossos objetivos, enquanto mulher empoderada que quer se inserir no mercado de trabalho. Eu, particularmente, não quero adentrar no mercado de trabalho, trabalhar 10 horas, 8 horas por dia, ficar 3 horas no transporte público, voltar para casa cansada e não poder conviver com a minha filha, com as crianças da minha comunidade, com as crianças da minha família, com os meus amigos e com os meus familiares. Essa não é uma pauta que eu reivindico, mas, infelizmente, esse é o sistema no qual estamos inseridos, e eu, particularmente, me sinto deixada para trás. sinto que a minha maternidade enquanto mulher negra, ela não provoca empatia. E de que as pessoas naturalizaram que, enquanto mulher negra, eu sou forte, eu sou plenamente capaz de lidar com tudo isso como uma máquina. Às vezes eu adoeço e eu tenho que cuidar da minha filha, mesmo com febre e dor no corpo, porque eu não tenho um amparo, uma rede de apoio ou quem cuide de mim. E fico pensando o quanto isso é desumano, mas, ao mesmo tempo, o quanto eu não posso parar e encontrar caminhos, principalmente dentro da espiritualidade. Eu também sou de matriz africana. Mas o quanto é difícil e o quanto é revoltante perceber o quanto a maternidade negra ela é invisibilizada, mesmo nos espaços onde as pessoas dizem que elas possuem um letramento racial. E eu queria que a senhora comentasse um pouco sobre isso. Muito obrigada. A senhora é muito linda e eu sou sua fã, Tiete.
First of all, you are not lagging behind. That's the language that disturbs me more. I think what you have described is the reality of Black women in this country, in the United States, in many different places. So what you are saying is actually very familiar. The issue is, how can Black women like yourself find other Black women like yourself who have a critical consciousness on all this? What I'm hearing from you is you're critical of, right? You're critical of this system that you're in, I think quite rightly. But what needs to happen is developing some structures that are critical for you that may not be out there where you're looking. I don't particularly care if people, I've been surprisingly not caring about what people thought about me for a long time. I worried about what the people who I cared about thought of me. But the rest of it, I performed quite nicely as in, oh, I'm so happy, thank you, blah, 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 blah. And I just thought, you really don't care about me, do you? No, I know you don't. So, because I refuse to give away my emotional energy to those projects that were tearing me down, while recognizing that the doors and the barriers were real. So one way of coming at this is how much do you love that beautiful baby? That one right in front of you. That one, the cute one. That's your baby, right? Yeah. How much do you love that beautiful baby? It's not about being strong Black woman, all those images. You shouldn't need this, you shouldn't do that. It's not about all the shoulds and oughts and finger waving and all that. It's about you and her. And building the kind of life and the kind of relationship that nurtures both of you, and finding anybody else around you who understands that and can support you in doing that. And that may come from very unexpected sources. It may come from some men that you did not anticipate. It may come from Black women. You may find other Black women not sympathetic at all because you somehow represent something to them they don't want to be. But this is the notion of being critical of what's around you and then create it. I didn't say much tonight about creativity, but I would usually say quite a bit about creativity, thinking outside the box. I mean, you see the boxes that are around you, but what can you do differently? And I realize I wish I could give a recipe answer, kind of like a cookbook. You take 2 eggs and then you do this, and then you have a cake at the end. It doesn't work that way. This is one of those trial and error moving through life experiences. But as long as you are extremely clear what your bottom line is, and your bottom line is your survival and that of your baby, then it becomes easier to see what the choices are, and also clearer as to why you're making the choices you're making, and knowing when too much is too much, and when just enough is just enough. I want a picture, by the way. Eu tenho foto com você e sua filha. Okay, good. Okay.
Olá, eu sou Luiz, eu sou terceiro semestre de Ciências Sociais, um aspirante a cientista social, que eu gosto de falar. E eu queria falar algo que foi falado aqui sobre o lugar, saber de onde viemos e o ponto de saber de onde viemos e o nosso pertencimento no mundo. No Brasil, um ponto muito importante é a miscigenação, e particularmente o que me atrai mais é o miscigenado. Eu, particularmente, meu pai é preto e minha mãe é branca, então minha vida inteira eu nunca soube o meu pertencimento e o que exatamente eu era. A questão racial e a questão do racismo nunca foi muito pertinente, tipo, nunca ocupou um espaço muito importante na minha cabeça, até um dia, voltando de um passeio da escola, eu estava gabando para os meus amigos, todos brancos, sobre como eu não tinha me queimado do sol, e a diretora da minha escola branca falou: "Ah, Luiz, você é diferente da gente, né? Tu tem um pezinho na senzala, né?" E foi a primeira vez que eu tive contato direto com o racismo, e eu comecei a me ver pertencendo a esse mundo. E se deparar com o racismo e começar a repensar momentos da minha vida que eu sofri microagressões e certos comentários dos meus amigos que eu nunca tinha parado para pensar, eu nunca tinha reparado, e eu vi muito no seu conceito de poder epistêmico sobre como as pessoas que estão na situação de poder montam e constroem as regras meio que desse jogo que nós estamos vivendo, nós somos obrigados a jogar, e como chega num ponto em que nós nem percebemos essas regras, a gente nem percebe que a gente faz parte dessa luta, a gente nem percebe que a gente faz parte de uma minoria, a gente nem percebe as microagressões, a gente acha que as piadas que nós ouvimos dos nossos amigos na nossa vida inteira são só piadas, isso é o que a gente sempre ouve. Então, eu sempre achei muito interessante sobre a construção do ator político e do ativista político na sociedade. Como você consegue falar para essas pessoas que nem mesmo conseguem se ver pertencentes à luta, pertencentes a esse movimento, como que não conseguem se ver como podendo se colocar para fazer parte dessa disputa, como você consegue colocar na cabeça dessas pessoas que elas precisam participar dela? Como você consegue criar essa consciência? Como você consegue? Eu acho que é exatamente isso que você discutiu nessa aula que você acabou de fazer. Como construir essa consciência e essa noção de como, com ideias, conseguir mudar o sistema que a gente vive. Então, basicamente esse assunto que eu queria que você comentasse com um dedo na questão do miscigenado no Brasil e seu ponto de vista sobre isso.
I think it's a very tall order to talk to all of the mixed race people in Brazil and start there as your starting point, because that's just too big. I would start with asking, what are all the ways that the structures that are around you limit your ability to see inequality, and also give you heightened visibility on inequality based on who you are and where you are situated? I would start with you, and not what all these other people you want to change their minds and you can go off into the future together. Now, if you happen to figure out how to do that, please let me know, because that is really hard, all right? But notice that I'm starting with the notion of the question of mixed race in Brazil is actually a very new question. And I think it's going to take not a reality, it's not a new reality, but it's a new question in terms of discussing identity within this language, right? So again, I think earlier, I forgot who said it, but the idea of the racial democracy was meant to eliminate race and to say we are not like the United States where they have all that racism. Well, actually, you have two different versions of racism. And to begin to say, where do mixed race people fit in there kind of depends on how big that population is. So I think it's more people claiming their own story, their own historical trajectory, whatever it may be, rather than thinking that identity is just granted through the race of one's ancestors. But to really look at what you identify with not what you are identified by. Do you identify with mixed race / brown people / Brazilians who call themselves black Brazilians, whatever? Who are your people going to be? And there are quite a few people who are asking these exact same questions. This is not a lonely struggle here. But the bigger question is not where do we fit within things the way they are. How do we want to see things different than the way they are, so that we will comfortably live in whatever that society is? For me, the questions are big, important questions for Brazil. How are people who are white, and I'm not going to speak to the whiteness, because it's hard for me to understand who's white here. I'm always confused. I mean, seriously. So, I mean, I'm not even going to try and figure this whole thing out. All I know is I know I'm in a different landscape. And I'm like, that one's white? Really? I mean, I'm totally confused all the time. All right, so I realized that trying to do racial categorization here is not all that helpful. What seems to be more helpful is who's doing what, who's benefiting in this society, who is not. How does that match up with race, gender, class, age, indigeneity? And you can see the patterns. They are structural patterns. I'm a sociologist. I think I'm going to go with the structural patterns. But when it comes to your awareness of things does not mean they weren't there all along. It's the same. It's the coming awareness of things that are in fact quite real for lots of other people. So I think over time that's going to happen. But try not to be, there's an expression, the smarty pants. I don't know if you have that expression in Brazil. The smarty pants in the room who knows everything because she went to university kind of thing. Try not to be that person, all right? Try to be the person who is, all right, you didn't like that, did you? Uh-huh. Did not like what I just said. This is the censorship machine, all right? But try not to be that person and really, to be the intellectual leader, just continue to ask honest questions of yourself, right? I'll just say that. I think that's enough for now. Okay.
Boa noite, eu sou o Gabriel. Gostaria de agradecer pela palestra. Fiquei muito contente com a presença da Marta. Conheço a Marta, acompanho o trabalho dela. Inclusive, já tive a oportunidade de ser aluno da Ebony English. Tive uma experiência muito bacana. Então, é importante assim, essa questão que você falou da língua, né? A língua não mais como uma ferramenta do colonizador, mas também com uma possibilidade de conexão, né? Com a possibilidade de ressignificar e construir novos laços a partir da língua. Então, na experiência que eu tive na Ebony English, você estar com pessoas como eu e poder discutir não só sobre assuntos da sua cultura, mas assuntos, enfim, poder aprender vocabulários relacionados à arte negra, a cultura negra, é muito importante e traz também um sentimento de identificação e de pertencimento que acaba por engajar, acaba por motivar e manter a gente nessa jornada de aprender e estudar uma segunda língua. So I would like to put that in practice. I would like to put that in practice. Patricia, you said that racism is organized through multiple systems of power. So I suppose that we also need to resort to multiple and diversified strategies to combat racism, because racism has like many faces, has many sides, and many strategies to oppress we as a people. Something, I bought your book last week, but I didn't have the opportunity to read it yet. But you talked a lot about the power of ideas and how ideas, they play an important role in this relation Black people have with history, with culture. So in university, we have like a clear example of how they have whitewashed our history. And the example you gave us, like, I said something, they didn't give me the proper attention, and then somebody said the same, and the attention was given. So when it comes to power of ideas and these the fact of our history being whitewashed, I'd like to know what are the strategies or some strategies we can resort to so as to reclaim, so as to rescue our history. Because I have examples, especially in my family, of black children who are somehow lost in white ideas, in a white world. So on one hand, I see like, oh, I'm becoming more and more conscious, and I see like my nephew, who's just like 4 years old, reproducing something that I'm trying to combat. So how can we, as a people, reclaim our history so as to take part in this battle of ideas? It's this huge battle of ideas to not only construct, because we have a lot that we have already built, so we have a lot that we have already created, but sometimes we actually are learning something our people has already made up, has already created, but we are listening from like a different source, and we value that as important because it comes from a different source. So how can we get in touch with our history, and how can we combat this process of whitewashing?
I think the first thing to keep in mind is that we are all specialists, and there's no one best way to go about this. It's more a question for each of us to decide where we're going to put our energy and where we cannot. We cannot do everything. Initially, when you're noticing the world, it just all seems big and overwhelming, and you want to change it all at once, which would be great if that worked out. But what is much more reasonable and likely is to think about all the places where, if you're going to work with ideas, you actually do so. So in my case, I decided early on I was not going to be the leader of a social movement. I was not going to be the one that was at the protests. I was not going to be the one who was going to be doing all basically the front risky work, to be honest with you. I mean, the people who were taking all those risks in social movements, I was going to focus on family and ideas. So I focused on my own family, the whole question of raising your own children in a certain way is really important to me, because they don't get a second chance to be 4 years old and 5 years old and 6 years old. They get one chance to do that. So the things that we can do when children are very important. So that's the individual. That's why I'm coming back to focusing on children and youth again in my work. That's going to be a next phase, but that's where I started. I started as a teacher of children, not of university students or any of this fame and fortune stuff you see now. This is not where I started. I really started with that, and I've carried through what I've learned in those settings, teaching in schools, teaching kindergarten kids, teaching third graders, writing curriculum, really being in the just in the thick of doing the work of idea creation in spaces where we were free to do so. This is what I did in my early years of my career. I taught in the community schools movement in Boston. We ran a school. We ran it from top to bottom, kindergarten through 8th grade. We wrote the curriculum. Our school was completely, it sounds like your school in some ways, maybe. Our school were black kids, and we had figured out a way to do that. But what was freeing for me in that experience was the opportunity to experiment and to reclaim this kind of history that you're talking about, We taught Africa routinely. We taught kingdoms of Africa. We used art and music and dance and drama as sources of expression and analysis. A lot of what I'm doing now come from my 5 years of work in the community schools. And during that period of time, I did not get much money. In fact, I had very little money, which was okay with me. It's not why I was doing it. But it was really sending myself back to school so that I could be equipped to do the kind of work that I do now. So, for example, that was also during a social movement period when there was a lot going on. I had never been taught any Black history. There was no such thing in my schools. My education really was, I guess you used the expression whitewashed. That's what it was. It wasn't even washed. It was just white, right? So, I don't know what they were cleaning up. It was just white. So when I was teaching a classroom full of Black kids, I realized, I don't know stuff I should know. So I became an independent researcher so that I know how to find things out, because I don't assume that if it's not there, it's not real. I'm going to start looking for the stuff that's not there and make it real. So I think that's really the sort of the ideal work when I look at sort of my trajectory, and then just went on from there. So the whole question of doing certain kinds of work, but I have been very clear that my terrain of struggle is ideas. I use the expression intellectual activism to find all the places that I can where ideas can travel, and I will also translate my work and talk to high school students in a very different way that I talk to you tonight about similar ideas, or I will talk to university presidents about similar ideas that I talk with you about tonight in a very different way. So I've had the opportunity to see ideas are very portable if you know how to take them and if you know how to use them. So to me, the time that you're spending, the fact that you're noticing your nephew, the fact that you're noticing these relationships, that you are seeing the importance of the education that you've received thus far, and that you want to take it somewhere else, put you at the front of the line as an intellectual leader. You don't have to be an old, whatever, degreed person to do that. Some of the best stuff has come from people who are exactly in this pocket that you're in right now, asking this kind of question. So that's how I would answer that. Become a specialist in you, and you will figure out what is the best path to follow, and you will find along the way all of these colleagues and allies who may not be visible to you right now because you haven't met them yet, and you to them. But as you stay with this work, you will find these people. And those are the types of coalitions, the intellectual coalitions, that this work can engender, right? So when I'm at a place now of trying to protect it from the outside powers that be without becoming jaded about the possibilities for you, right? So I appreciate that question. Thank you.
Oi, eu sou meio baixinha, vocês estão me vendo? Aqui. Boa tarde, eu sou a Juliana, eu faço mestrado em literatura aqui na universidade e tenho uma pergunta para a mãe Marta e para a Patrícia, sobre mestiçagem também. O meu tema de estudo é como se deu a criação da imagem da mulher mestiça na literatura brasileira. Para isso, eu analiso a Rita Baiana e a Gabriela, de Gabriela Cravo e Canela. A questão, a minha pergunta é se o processo de mestiçagem no Brasil criou um novo outro. Então, a Patrícia falou na aula passada que a hegemonia, o poder hegemônico cria um outro para se tornar o melhor poder, ou um poder único, com capacidade de estabelecer o poder epistemológico. E você falou hoje, mãe Marta, sobre eu entendi isso, sobre a homogeneização e a tentativa de homogeneização e apagamento de identidade. E como isso se dá para a mulher mestiça, para vocês? E quais são as imagens que vêm sobre essa criação da mestiçagem como o outro e a mulher mestiça como a outra? É isso.
I think your study is going to be very interesting in terms of how an author, this is a fictional work you're dealing with? All right. An author can investigate those kinds of questions in ways that a social scientist cannot. What I would say about the notion of mixed race is this. It is very much up to each mixed race individual to, number one, claim that identity of he, she, they want, and two, to attribute meaning to that category. So the meaning of the category will not come from those from above. It will come from those to whom that category is assigned and how they use, claim, and refine that particular category. Mixed race people may decide, no, we don't want this category, we want another one. Or they may decide, this is the future of Brazil. We're all mixed race in some way, and this gives us a way of talking about the mixture in Brazil. But we cannot do this by ignoring the power relations that created the mixture. So to do that in a historic way is to actually replicate the problem that has been in place for so long. I don't see an easy answer to a complicated question. That's what I'm really trying to say. This is a complicated question, and it is one that is going to come from the type of scholarship and meetings and organization and political advocacy. It's going to come from people. But I guess all I'm arguing is that people be allowed to do that. See, what we want in the academy often is closure that makes it easier for us to do other things. We want to know what a term means so we can use it accurately. Or in some cases, people want to define the term themselves so that they can use it for their own vested interests. And I'm arguing that it's important to keep this kind of language more fluid. It's not loosey-goosey, it's quite real. But I would look ahead, not in the past. What are the implications of the work that I am doing now for Brazil 20 and 30 years from now? That, to me, would be an appropriate question. You need not know the answer, but to think about where are we going with this? Where are other people going with this discussion of mixed race? Who is resonating with it, and what understanding of mixed race do they have when they do? What is the conflict in there over the ownership of this particular term? So there's a lot going on with this particular term. I think there are similar issues that affect intersectionality as a term, that in many ways take away its power if it stays within the rarefied atmosphere of the academy. But I'm arguing that the answers to your question, even though you're doing an academic study, which is important, the answers may not lie totally in the academy.
Realmente concordo, questão complexa, mas eu penso o seguinte. Vou até falar do caso da Gabriela. Bom, a primeira coisa é que o mestiço no Brasil, eu não sei hoje, mas quando eu era criança, o mestiço não sabia que era mestiço. Ele achava que era branco e que era melhor que os negros. E aí as pessoas olhavam para pessoas como eu, por exemplo, e falavam assim, nossa, Martinha, você é muito inteligente para ser uma preta, você não é negra, você é muito inteligente. Você é pretinha, mas você é bonitinha. Esse tipo de coisa. Então, eu acho que a primeira coisa que a gente tem que pensar no cenário brasileiro, porque é diferente do americano, é que o mestiço no Brasil não se reconhece como negro muitas vezes. No caso da mulher negra, quando a gente fala da mulher negra mestiça, de cabelo liso, como é o caso da Gabriela, ela é uma mulher profundamente estereotipada, né? Hipersexualizada. E esse personagem ele é realmente um outro, porque viver naquele mundo de fantasias, onde esse personagem é feliz, esse personagem é realizado sexualmente, inclusive, que a realidade da mulher negra é totalmente diferente daquela, porque é rejeitada, porque não é o padrão de beleza, porque, mesmo sendo clara, tem uma coisa no corpo dela que não a deixa aderente à imagem, né, que a sociedade entende que é a imagem da beleza, né. É um lugar muito fragilizado na minha leitura, né, e eu acho que parte do imaginário realmente de quem criou o outro, e esse outro é um homem que criou esse outro. Porque uma mulher não vai olhar essa outra mulher desse jeito, nesse lugar. Então, é uma questão complexa. Eu acho que o seu trabalho é um trabalho de extrema relevância e que precisa de muita atenção a esses pontos para não escorregar e cair de vez, né, nessa estereotipagem. Mas é um trabalho de profunda relevância para uma sociedade como a brasileira, onde as pessoas são mestiças e não sabem que são frutos de estupro, que não sabem que são frutos de sequestro. Aqui a gente ouve esse tipo de coisa. Pegou no laço, casou com a minha avó no laço. A pessoa não entende que essa pessoa provavelmente era uma pessoa indígena e que foi pega no laço para ser estuprada, né? Então, é isso. Acho que é muito complexo, não dá nem para nomear, porque faz parte até do lugar onde o mestiço se vê nesta sociedade.
Boa noite a todas e todos e todes. Boa noite, professora. Boa noite à mesa. Meu nome é Suzana. Eu sou doutoranda em Filosofia do Direito pela Universidade de São Paulo. E, bom, professora, primeiro eu queria dizer como foi elucidador ler o seu livro, Pensamento Feminista Negro, porque ele desconstruiu vários mitos que giravam em torno do pensamento feminista negro aqui no Brasil, principalmente nas esquerdas, né? Nada como ler de fato para a gente poder falar sobre um assunto, né? Que aqui tem muito todo lugar, né? Tem muito essa mania de criticar sem ler. E uma das principais críticas que ouvíamos diziam a respeito a que o empoderamento seria um termo individualista, né? Porque falaria apenas do indivíduo, como o eu que se empodera. E, de fato, nós vimos como o mercado capturou esse termo. Vimos como coisas, compre este produto e se empodere. E, lendo o seu livro, ficou muito claro que o feminismo negro, embora reconheça como é fundamental que as mulheres negras construam uma imagem autodefinida de valorização de si própria, fora das imagens de controle da sociedade racista, como a mulata de exportação, como falava Lélia Gonzalez, você fala que a luta do feminismo negro é holística. É também, ou talvez primordialmente, uma luta por justiça social e para todos. Ou seja, feminismo negro está longe de ser só um empoderamento de indivíduos. E, a partir dessa ideia, a minha pergunta seria, eu queria ouvir a opinião da senhora sobre como que a senhora, que há tantos anos estuda interseccionalidade, vê esse debate quente que está atualmente nas esquerdas no mundo todo, sobre o conflito atual entre as chamadas lutas identitárias e o discurso da luta de classes, que para alguns seria anterior, ou maior, ou principal, ou antecedente, né? A questão é que, como nos mostrou de novo a Lélia, já nos anos 70 e 80, uma cegueira das esquerdas para o racismo e as relações profundas entre raça e classe no Brasil. Como, por exemplo, que a classe proletária, subjugada, marginalizada no Brasil, é essencialmente negra. E ela nos conta como comparecia a eventos, conferências, e as pessoas com discursos muito bonitos sobre anticapitalismo, derrubada da sociedade de classes, e absolutamente nenhuma palavra sobre raça, quando a massa proletária no Brasil é negra. Então, partindo do pressuposto de que hoje é impossível falarmos de uma luta por justiça social sem falarmos de uma luta contra o racismo, nós sabemos que muito hoje se fala, e até tornou popular dizer, que não existe capitalismo sem racismo. Mas, e sem capitalismo, há racismo? Se nós acabássemos hoje com o capitalismo, acabaria o racismo? Como você vê essa luta entre os discursos de interseccionalidade e uma pressuposição de que classe é algo interior? Porque a gente sabe também que, sem condições econômicas dignas, como lutamos contra o racismo? Nós temos visto no Brasil como a austeridade fiscal, por exemplo, inviabiliza uma luta contra o racismo. Então, basicamente, essa é a minha pergunta. Como a senhora vê essa complexa relação entre discursos interseccionais por justiça social e luta de classes? E se seria possível dizer que, se acabássemos com o capitalismo, o racismo desapareceria ou não? Obrigada.
I'm going to have a really quick initial answer. I don't believe in utopia. So the question of if capitalism ended, would racism go away, I think I'm not going to spend my time on a thought question like that, because it implies a utopia beyond what I can see in the here and now. But bringing it down a little more to recognize that in many ways what's happened with class analysis and left movements around the world is the recognition that workers are not following them, because work is not what they're talking about it being. In many ways, intersectionality has had a class analysis in it from the inception. It doesn't have to add a class analysis in. What is visible is race and gender, but the reason it's visible is very much because of class and poverty and disempowerment. So this is not something that came about as an identitarian discourse, which is how it's often been recast. Black feminism and these movements are all about identity, and they want us to recognize them. Why can't they see that we have the right answers, because class is fundamental to everything they're saying? So this is really very much a discourse that says class analysis, which, by the way, has many strong points. I'm just not stressing them tonight. But class analysis is really the theoretical analysis of how power and social inequality and social change work. And we already own that. And why are you playing in our backyard by bringing in all these black people and these all these other people who we're used to thinking about as our data and not necessarily as our colleagues? So that same kind of thinking is just as problematic to me on the left as it is on the right, all right? Because it is one that does not see large numbers of people as perfectly capable of making their own decisions about their own lives, and doesn't necessarily respect the decisions that they are in fact making about their own lives. So, all right, before I get myself all worked up about this, let me back up and just say this. I think what is happening now that is really encouraging is attention among theorists to look at capitalism again, and to really think about the ways in which not just race, because it isn't just racism, it's race, it's sexuality, it's a complex view of human experience, how that speaks to class. Class is being demoted from being the super theory that explained everything to one very important door that one enters to end up in the room of intersectionality. So I, for one, am really happy about the increasing attention to class that is going on in social struggles, that is attempting to build alliances among populations where part of the shared struggle is a shared class position. This is certainly the case in the US. The divide and conquer has just been so successful with the white working class in the US and other classes of color. Has basically convinced the white working class to vote against its own class interests in terms of education, healthcare, all kinds of things. So the more we can begin to have a class analysis that really is intersectional, that gets people to look at the reality of each other's experiences and say, what does a global class look like now in contemporary global capitalism? This is not 500 years ago. This is not industrial capitalism. This is not early industrial capitalism. We're looking at artificial intelligence. So this is a period of time where we really have to not fight with people who are in the way, all right? And to say, no, there's plenty of work here for everybody. And my perspective is, I'm just not going to have those kinds of arguments. I had those arguments 40 years ago in graduate school. Why would I do that now? Nothing dramatically has changed in the last 40 years that has come directly from class analysis. But class analysis is extremely good at explaining capitalism. It's not necessarily as good in explaining all dimensions of capitalism beyond work, nor does it do a particularly good job in in sort of pointing the way forward for what one does in these situations. So I think there's plenty of room for growth on everybody's part. But I'm not going to get into a binary of who has the right answer, the identitarianisms of the class people. That is the wrong question for me. Maybe for others it's fine, but not for me.
Muito obrigada, Patrícia, muito obrigada, Marta, e muito obrigada a toda essa gente linda que está aqui conosco hoje. E nós temos a última aula pública da Patrícia na próxima segunda-feira, e eu espero ver todo mundo aqui de novo. Boa noite.